Like and subscribe and click the bell icon to get new video updates.
US warns against allowing Chinese military base in Solomon Islands, promises to fast-track reopening an embassy. One of Joe Biden's top advisors has urged Solomon Islands not to allow a Chinese military base in the country, warning the United States would respond accordingly to any steps in that direction. The National Security Council's Kurt Campbell says the U.S. will respond accordingly to any steps by China to establish a de facto military presence. Former diplomat James Carouso says the stoush shows the U.S. decision to close its embassy in Honiara 30 years ago was a mistake. The White House is also promising to bring forward the re-establishment of a U.S. embassy in Honiara and to provide the country with more medical aid. It comes as a former senior American diplomat criticized the decision to close the embassy almost 30 years ago, suggesting the U.S. had sought to outsource its relationships in the region. This week's visit to Honiara by senior U.S. officials, including the Indo Pacific coordinator of the National Security Council, Kurt Campbell, came too late to prevent the signing of a security pact between Solomon Islands and China. Both the US and Australia are worried the deal could lead to Beijing establishing a base less than 2,000 kilometres off the Queensland coast, despite assurances from Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare this would not happen. A White House summary of the trip said the US delegation used a 90-minute meeting with Mr Sogavare and 24 members of his cabinet to raise concerns about the potential regional security implications of the deal. Election news. The U.S. delegation outlined clear areas of concern with respect to the purpose, scope, and transparency of the agreement, the statement said. If steps are taken to establish a de facto permanent military presence, power projection capabilities, or a military installation, the delegation noted that the United States would then have significant concerns and would respond accordingly. The White House said it would expedite the opening of a U.S. embassy in Solomon Islands and provide more assistance in areas such as unexploded ordnance, vaccines and medical support. Referring to a critical juncture, it said the two countries had also agreed to a high-level strategic dialogue to discuss security issues of mutual concern in more detail. Analysis from our experts. Locally, Shadow Minister for Education Tanya Plibersek welcomed the move to reopen a U.S. embassy in Solomon Islands. I think the fact that the U.S. embassy has been closed in the Solomons for some time is perhaps something, something to be remedied now, she told ABC News Breakfast. Australia is a Pacific nation. And the United States has very strong interests in the Pacific as well. We are always delighted, Australia is always delighted, when the United States pays more attention to our Pacific neighbourhood. You can treat a country with neglect. Carouso says closing U.S. embassy was a mistake. The signing of the security pact raised alarm in both Washington and Canberra and has become a source of heated debate during Australia's federal election campaign. It has also raised questions as to whether the U.S. had failed by outsourcing its regional policymaking to Australia. We haven't had an embassy in Solomon Islands for a very long time. And that, I think, in itself, speaks volumes, said James Carouso, a former acting U.S. ambassador to Australia. You can treat a country with neglect, or outsource your relationships, certainly not if you want to be an influence in the region, without having a presence on the ground. So, yeah, that was, I think, a mistake for the United States over a long time. Read more. Mr Carouso, who is now the Australia Chair for the Washington-based Centre for Strategic and International Studies, said the West's fear was that China would establish a military base in Solomon Islands to cut Australia off from the US if worst came to worst. He said it was now up to the US and Australia to ensure the pact was not abused by China. This is going to be a multi-act play and this is Act 1, he said. So, I think, for Australia, United States, Japan, the other Western democracies, the other Pacific Island nations, they should try and work with the Solomons to make sure Act 2 is peaceful, and protects Solomon Islands' sovereignty and protects the sovereignty and freedom of decision of other island states in the region. Space to play or pause. M to mute. left and right arrows to seek, up and down arrows for volume. Ask us a question or share your story. All fields are required unless marked optional. Posted 6 hours ago, updated 24 m ago.